In 2006, Brian Shaffer went out for drinks with friends. He was caught on CCTV entering the bar, but never leaving. To this day, nobody knows what happened. The story begins with a man who should have had it all. His name was Brian Randall Shaffer, born on February 11th, 1979, in Pickerington, a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio. To most, his life seemed like the picture of promise. Tall, athletic, with the easy charm of someone who could laugh at his own mistakes and dream beyond the ordinary. He was the kind of person people noticed, not just because of his 6'2" frame or the dark hair he often wore pushed casually to one side, but because of the way his presence carried warmth. But behind every life that shines outwardly, there are shadows that creep just out of sight. Brian had grown up in a family that knew love, but also hardship. His mother, Renee, was at the heart of his world, and she had been fighting a long and merciless illness, myelodysplasia, a rare disease of the bone marrow. By 2006, her struggle had reached its end. In March of that year, just weeks before Brian would vanish, she passed away. The loss carved something deep into him. His friends and family saw it. His father, Randy, said the grief lay across Brian like a heavy coat he could not take off. Yet life doesn't wait for grief to finish its work. Brian was in his second year of medical school at Ohio State University. By all accounts, he was thriving academically, if exhausted from the long nights of study. Medicine was a demanding path, and though he was good at it, his heart sometimes longed for something simpler. Those who knew him said he often fantasized about escaping the grind, abandoning the long nights under fluorescent hospital lights for the warmth of a tropical beach. He loved music, especially Jimmy Buffett, and had confessed to more than one person that he dreamed of becoming a musician, sipping rum with the sea just outside his door. Still, medicine remained his reality, and in 2006, his life seemed stable, even happy. He had a girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, who was as smitten with him as he was with her. They were deeply in love, enough that those closest to Brian suspected he would propose to her soon. The two had even planned a spring break trip to Miami, tickets already purchased for April 3rd, just 2 days after he would walk into the Ugly Tuna Saloona bar and never walk out. On the evening of March 31st, the day before his disappearance, Brian shared dinner with his father at a steakhouse. They talked over plates of food, the kind of casual but meaningful conversation only family shares, when both understand that grief still hangs heavy, but life must move forward. Randy would later recall his son looked tired, medical school had drained him, and the grief of his mother's death lingered. Still, Brian laughed, smiled, carried on as though determined to hold it together. After dinner, Randy said goodbye, unaware it would be the last time he would ever see his son. That night, Brian had other plans. He was meeting friends for drinks, a small attempt at levity after weeks of darkness. He linked up with his close friend, Clint Florence, around 9 p.m. Together, they decided to go bar hopping through Columbus's Arena District, a place alive with neon lights, the thrum of music spilling from every doorway, and the constant ebb and flow of college students seeking escape. Their night began at the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a second-floor bar near campus. The bar was accessible only by a long escalator or a set of stairs, its entrance watched over by cameras. Inside, the scene was what you would expect. Low light, laughter, music, and the haze of alcohol softening everything at the edges. Brian and Clint started the evening there but quickly set out again, moving from bar to bar, shot to shot, blending into the tide of the city's nightlife. At some point, Brian called Alexis. She was out of town that weekend visiting her parents, but their conversation was short, sweet, filled with the kind of affection only those deeply in love share. He told her he loved her. He told her he would see her soon. She would later recall that nothing in his tone suggested despair, secrecy, or any hint of what was about to happen. By midnight, they met up with another friend, Meredith Reed, who offered them a ride back to the Ugly Tuna. Together, the three ascended the escalator once again into the glowing, humming interior of the bar. Surveillance cameras captured them entering around 1:15 a.m. What happened next would etch Brian's name into the cold ledger of America's unsolved mysteries. Inside the bar, Brian seemed his usual self. He laughed, chatted, mingled, even shared drinks with strangers. As the hours crawled toward closing time, Clint and Meredith lost track of him in the crowd. Around 1:55 a.m., surveillance footage shows Brian standing just outside the bar, speaking casually with two young women. He seems relaxed, smiling, not in distress. The women would later confirm the conversation was brief, harmless. They said he seemed fine. Then, at 1:57 a.m., the camera captures Brian stepping back through the entrance of the Ugly Tuna. He vanishes into the crowd. That is the last confirmed sighting of him. When the lights came up at 2 a.m. and the bar began to empty, Brian was nowhere to be found. Clint and Meredith searched inside, calling out, scanning the crowd, but he was gone. They assumed perhaps he had left early, maybe gone home, without telling them. Outside, the streets thinned as the night gave way to silence. But still, no Brian. When Monday arrived, Alexis waited for him at the airport. They were supposed to board their flight to Miami together, but Brian never arrived. He never even checked in. That was when panic began to take root, not just in his girlfriend's heart, but in the city of Columbus. And so begins the disappearance, a case wrapped in impossibilities, unanswered questions, and theories that lead into darkness. When Brian didn't board the plane for Miami, Alexis's world cracked. She waited at the airport, suitcase at her side, her heart lifting with each new arrival, expecting to see his tall figure striding toward her, smiling that familiar, effortless smile. But the gate closed. The flight departed, and the seat beside her remained empty. That was the moment everything shifted. The police were called, missing person reports were filed, and the investigation into one of Columbus's most baffling mysteries began. At first, the case seemed straightforward. Here was a man, last seen entering a bar. Surveillance cameras watched the entrance. He had friends there, witnesses, a timeline. Surely they would find him within hours. Perhaps he had gone home drunk and slept it off. Perhaps he had wandered into another bar. Perhaps he would turn up with an embarrassed laugh, explaining he'd blacked out and lost track of time. But hours became days. Days became weeks. And the search revealed nothing. The Ugly Tuna Saloona was perched on the second floor of the South Campus Gateway complex, accessible by a long escalator that funneled patrons up from the street. The entrance was guarded by surveillance cameras, their lenses sweeping across the escalator, the door, and the surrounding walkway. Investigators pored over the footage. There he was, Brian, arriving at 1:15 a.m. with Clint and Meredith, riding the escalator up into the bar. There he was again at 1:55 a.m., standing outside the entrance, chatting with two women. The camera caught his movements clearly. The timestamp confirmed the moment. And then he stepped back inside and never emerged again. The footage showed the bar emptying out. Dozens of patrons filed down the escalator, couples stumbling arm in arm, clusters of friends shouting to one another over the noise of the night. Staff members left. Musicians packed up their instruments. But not once did the cameras record Brian leaving. It was as though he had simply ceased to exist between one frame and the next. Police double-checked the footage, then triple-checked. They slowed it down, frame by frame, searching for even the faintest glimpse of him slipping away in disguise, his tall frame concealed beneath a hood or a hat. But nothing. The only men resembling Brian who appeared on the footage were quickly identified and cleared. The camera didn't lie. He went in. He did not come out. And yet, he wasn't in the bar anymore. Detectives treated the ugly tuna as a crime scene. They searched every corner of the bar, the restrooms, the closets, the utility rooms, the roof. They combed the nearby construction site that lay beyond the service exit, at the rear of the bar, a dimly lit area filled with scaffolding and debris. The kind of place someone could slip into unnoticed or be dragged into against their will. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They sniffed the bar. They sniffed the construction site. They sniffed the dumpsters lined along the street below. Nothing. No trace of Brian, not a drop of blood, not a shred of clothing, not even a scent trail leading away. The dumpsters were emptied and examined. Landfills were considered. If a body had been hidden there, it would have been discovered. But there was nothing. Detectives expanded their search radius. They scoured nearby streets, alleys, and riverbanks. They questioned taxi drivers. They searched hospitals, shelters, and jails. They plastered Brian's face on flyers across Columbus. A smiling young man with hazel eyes, 6'2", with a distinct black fleck in his left iris. His friends and family walked those same streets, handing out posters, pleading for information. The city responded with whispers. Some claimed to have seen him wandering downtown. Others thought they spotted him near campus. A few said he had been seen near the river, but each lead, when investigated, dissolved into nothing. Police interviewed everyone who had been with Brian that night. Meredith Reed cooperated fully. So did Alexis, who returned from her parents' home and spent sleepless nights calling Brian's phone, hoping to hear his voice on the other end. Clint Florence, however, was different. He spoke to police, but when asked to take a polygraph, he refused. Meredith took one. Alexis took one. Both passed, but Clint would not. To some, it meant nothing. Polygraphs are unreliable, and refusing one is not an admission of guilt. But to others, it added a layer of unease to an already unthinkable disappearance. Clint would later hire a lawyer who advised him not to speak further with investigators or the media. Over time, his silence grew louder than any denial he might have given. To this day, some whisper his name when the case is discussed. Others insist he simply did not want to be dragged into the endless spiral of suspicion and grief. But the fact remained, one of Brian's closest friends that night chose silence, and silence has a weight of its own. As weeks turned into months, hope began to wither. But in September of that same year, a strange thing happened. Alexis, still calling Brian's phone every night before bed, suddenly heard something she had not in months. The call rang. Not once, not twice, 3 times. The signal pinged off a cell tower in Hilliard, a suburb just 14 miles away. Investigators checked with the carrier, who suggested it might have been nothing more than a glitch, a ghost in the system. But for Alexis, it was a moment of raw, piercing hope. For a moment, she believed he was alive. Somewhere out there, her boyfriend still breathed. But no further pings ever came. The phone went silent once more, leaving behind nothing but questions. By the time the year drew to a close, investigators were left with little more than theories, each one more unsettling than the last. Had Brian slipped out through the back service exit, unnoticed by the cameras, and met with disaster in the construction site? Had he been assaulted inside the bar, hidden in some impossible corner, and carried away without being seen? Had he left willingly, abandoning his life, his family, his future in medicine, and the woman he was planning to marry? Or was it something else entirely? The Ugly Tuna became a place of whispers. Students passed by the escalator and felt a shiver crawl up their spine. They remembered the tall young man who went in but never came out. And they wondered if, in some way that no one could explain, the bar had swallowed him whole. The weeks after Brian Shaffer's disappearance gave birth to questions that multiplied like shadows in the dark. When no answers surfaced, theories began to grow in their place. Some were grounded in logic, others in desperation, and still others in paranoia. Together, they formed a tapestry of speculation, each thread as unnerving as the last. The most obvious question was simple. If Brian didn't leave the bar through the main entrance, then where did he go? Detectives studied the layout of the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Beyond the main entrance, there was only one other way out, the service door at the rear. That door led into a dim, narrow hallway, and then out into the construction site behind the bar. It was possible, investigators admitted, that Brian had used that exit. The cameras watching the main entrance wouldn't have caught him there. But that possibility raised darker questions. Why would he use the back? And what happened to him once he did? The construction site was dangerous, littered with debris, holes, and heavy machinery. Perhaps he had stumbled drunkenly into the chaos and fallen, unseen, into a place where no one thought to look. But cadaver dogs had scoured that area. Police had searched it meticulously. Nothing was found. And the idea that a 6'2" man could vanish into rubble without leaving even a trace. It strained belief. Another theory whispered through the investigation was darker still. What if Brian had been killed, whether by accident or by intent, and his body hidden inside a dumpster behind the bar? The thought carried a bleak logic. A dumpster would provide concealment, and in the chaos of a bar closing at 2 a.m., perhaps no one would notice. If the dumpster had been emptied before anyone suspected Brian was missing, his remains could have been carried to a landfill, lost forever in a sea of refuse. Detectives investigated this angle. They inspected dumpsters, questioned sanitation workers, studied schedules. But again, they found nothing. Landfills were considered, but there was no evidence to justify tearing through mountains of waste. The dumpster theory lingered, heavy with unease. It remained plausible, but like every other possibility, it dissolved under the weight of the unknown. Columbus is a city built on water, its rivers winding like black veins beneath its streets. Inevitably, some speculated that Brian's body might have ended up in one of them. If he had stumbled into the night and wandered too far, perhaps he reached the Olentangy River, just blocks away from campus. Perhaps he had fallen in, the current pulling him beneath its surface, burying him in silt and silence. But rivers give back what they take. Bodies resurface, bloated and broken, carried by the tide to the shore. Yet in the weeks, months, and years that followed, no such discovery was made. The river kept its silence, or else it had nothing to give. Among the most unsettling theories was the idea that Brian had chosen to vanish. Those who knew him best remembered the grief he carried over his mother's death. They remembered the way he spoke of escape, of beaches and warm winds, of starting fresh. His father, Randy, admitted it was possible. Alexis, though shattered by the thought, conceded that Brian had always been capable of surprising decisions. Could he have walked away? Could he have slipped out of the bar unnoticed, abandoning everything, his family, his career, the woman he loved, to build a new life in secret? Skeptics pointed to the impossibility of such an act. Brian had no passport with him that night, no large sum of money, no preparation that anyone knew of. To vanish without a trace required planning. And Brian, by all accounts, had not planned. And yet the idea clung to the edges of the case, because if he hadn't left willingly, then the alternatives grew darker. There was one more theory. If Brian didn't leave by himself, then perhaps someone made sure he never did. Some pointed to the strangers he had spoken with outside the bar. Others whispered about altercations inside. Theories grew like weeds. Brian angered the wrong person. Brian was assaulted in the bar and hidden away. Brian was targeted for reasons unknown. And then there was Clint Florence. His refusal to take a polygraph, his withdrawal into silence, his lawyer's protective wall, all of it fueled suspicions. Some believed Clint knew more than he admitted. Others believed he had nothing to hide, and that the weight of suspicion simply destroyed his willingness to cooperate. Without evidence, the whispers remained whispers, but they have never gone away. Years later, in 2008, an eerie moment reignited the case. A photo surfaced online, linked to a possible sighting of Brian in Mexico. The image showed a man lying on a bed, resembling Brian in striking ways. The story spread quickly. Had he really escaped, starting a new life under the sun? The FBI examined the photo. They compared facial features, studied every detail. In the end, they determined it was not him. Just another ghost in a case already filled with them. But for those who believed he lived, the photo was proof enough. For those who believed he died, it was another cruel trick in a story built on vanishing acts. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer was not just the loss of a man. It was the beginning of a wound that never closed. His father, Randy, became the most tireless voice in the search. He handed out flyers, gave interviews, begged for information. He walked the streets of Columbus with Brian's picture in his hand, asking strangers if they had seen his son. But tragedy has a way of compounding. In 2008, a violent storm ripped through Ohio. Randy was killed when a tree fell onto his home. The man who had fought for his son's memory was taken without warning, leaving the family's burden to others. At Randy's funeral, Alexis placed her phone number inside the casket. A message to Brian, wherever he might be, Call me. Find me. Come home. But the phone never rang. Alexis never stopped searching. For years, she kept Brian's face alive in media interviews, online forums, and missing persons groups. She became the keeper of his memory, the voice reminding the world that his story was not yet finished. The police, too, have never officially closed the case. Leads are still investigated, tips still followed. Every so often, a new whisper emerges. A sighting in another city, another country, another life. And every time, the hope rises, only to crash again. The ugly Tuna Saloona eventually closed its doors, its name forever tied to the disappearance. For years, it remained a place of unease in the city's memory. Students would ride the escalator past its darkened windows and feel the weight of absence pressing against the glass. A man walked into that place, and the cameras recorded it. The city watched him enter, and the world has never seen him since. Today, Brian Shaffer exists in two places: in the memories of those who loved him, and in the endless speculation of strangers who study his case. He is frozen in time, a medical student with hazel eyes and an easy smile, forever 27, forever walking into a bar he would never walk out of. His story has become a kind of modern legend, not because of monsters or ghosts, but because of the silence he left behind. To this day, the case remains open, and the escalator leading up to the second floor of the gateway carries with it a lingering truth that sometimes the scariest stories are not the ones we invent, but the ones we cannot explain. It's been over 17 years, and Brian Shaffer remains missing. Do you think he escaped his life or met with something darker? Let me know your theory in the comments. This is Dark Matter Crimes. Subscribe to our channel to keep getting updates on crimes like this.